So before we dive into the intricacies of evolution and speciation and how it happens and how it doesn't happen, I want to start off with kind of looking at a history of evolutionary thought. And you might think that's kind of pointless, like why look at how we came up with these ideas? But I want to bring them up because it almost follows the understanding that regular people have. And it's also kind of interesting to learn about some of the original scientists that came up with the different ideas and the small breakthroughs that happened along the way. Their ideas have not only molded the scientific literature at the time, but continue to make a huge impact on scientific thinking today. So we're going to kind of go in order of our evolutionary scientists. But before we do, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page of what I mean by evolution. And the simplest definition of evolution is just a change in the genetic variance of a population over time. Now, in this course, we are going to dissect that sentence over and over and over again. But just simply looking, you have a population, so a group of organisms of the same species, and how is their genetic variance, or what makes them change over time. So let's start with our first scientist. And our first scientist, you could argue, wasn't really much of a scientist at all. We're going to take a look at Plato, so one of our, revolutionary thinkers of the time. He's kind of usually listed up there with Aristotle and Socrates. Now, he's kind of like an odd place to start because he thought that species were static, that they were unchanging. There was no idea of evolution at the time. Now, you may be wondering, why in the world am I including him if he thought nothing about it? And it's because he's really the first one to publish or record anything even related to it. Now, before Plato, people had created different books and volumes related to plants and animals that they saw. Plato actually also has created his own set of books, kind of documenting all sorts of species in the area. But he's really the first one to even think about the history of organisms. Everyone beforehand was just like, aha, tree, aha, animal. But he was like, aha, animal. But that animal's always been around. So while, yes, this is not very exciting, nothing has really happened, he's really the first one to give it any thought. Granted, his thought was, yeah, they've always been here, they always will be here, nothing is going to change with the organisms that we're seeing. So this was quite a long time ago, 450, 350 BC, so talking about a couple thousand years in the past. And with Plato, until our next scientist, not a lot happened. So the next scientist, or really naturalist we're going to talk about is Georges Louis Leclerc Comte de Buffon. I bolded Comte de Buffon because that is kind of the majority, or how I'm going to refer to his name, is just the last part of his name. The years you see listed here are not birth and death rates. Instead, these are publication dates. And so he was publishing a lot of information, and I'll talk about that information in a second. But he was publishing a lot of information over a very long period of time. So he was publishing for a little under 40 years, which is quite a long time, especially during this time period. Now, Comte de Buffon had some interesting ideas. Again, I mean, before him, no one's really talking about differences between organisms. Now, Comte de Buffon, like other rich people at the time, did do a lot of traveling around the world. And he noted that different geographical locations, if he was in sunnier or more arid areas or wetter areas, he noticed that different geographical locations had different types of organisms, and organisms that looked different, and organisms that had different traits depending on where they lived. Now, he didn't really develop it that much more, but he's really the first one to start taking all these travels that a lot of people at the time are doing and start making inferences and making, just observations about differences that exist in different areas. He also did have this hypothesis that all quadrupeds, so quadrupeds are organisms with 4 limbs. So a lot of our land animals that you and I think of, most of them are quadrupeds. And he hypothesized that actually all the quadrupeds that exist on Earth are descended from just 38 species. Well, if you think about it, I mean, this is kind of the idea of evolution, right? That we didn't start with billions of different species, that we had a very small set, and through adaptations and natural selections, we had a lot. So he came up with a crazy hypothesis. But he didn't develop it much, and he never really outright said it. Like, he said it during his 40 years of publication. Before I open up the next bullet point, something I want to make a note of is you're going to notice here soon that he's kind of like ADD. Like, his ideas are all over the place. He was publishing for 40 years, had strings of ideas all across of his writings. And looking back at it, it's like, what in the world was going on in this guy's head? Something I want you to keep in mind is this time period, the mid to late 1700s, living in Europe. The idea of persecution by the church is not just a fear, but a reality. That you could be killed if your views and the things that you spread went against the church. And so Comte de Buffon had to be careful with the way he was publishing his works, which is why he published so many books over such a long period of time, and why there's not one single book that is just about, oh, well, here is my full theory about how things came from 38 different species. It's more of, let me just put this sentence in here, and then I'm going to talk about pretty birds. And then let me put this big sentence here, and then let's talk about some insects. I like to remember him because we're going to talk about quite a few scientists. Comte de Buffon did not want to be a buffoon, so he didn't want to be, I guess, ridiculed, but really he just didn't want to be murdered for having this kind of scientific thinking, particularly in this time. The next bullet point that's about to come up, you do not need to write down, but I find it quite interesting. So Charles Darwin, who comes later on, we will talk about him. Charles Darwin talks about Comte de Buffon, and he says that Comte de Buffon is the first author who in modern times has treated it being evolution, in a scientific spirit was Buffon. But as his opinions fluctuated greatly at different periods, and he does not enter on the causes or means of the transformation of species. So Darwin is essentially giving credit to Buffon, saying like, he's pretty much the first person to ever have any kind of inkling of evolution. But Darwin also admits that he never explains, like, why did he think they came from 38 species and how did they come from 38 species? So Darwin's pretty much like, yeah, this guy, definitely the first person to think of evolution, but he did not, like, do all his homework. He wrote a 1-page paper versus the requirement of, like, a 15-page paper. Like, that's pretty much, like, Darwin's opinion of Comte de Buffon. So that is where our real story begins. So let's talk about our next scientist, James Hutton. And his pivotal text came out in 1795, so really not that long after Comte de Buffon. And James Hutton, we're actually going into a different field. We're going to go into geology. And James Hutton is kind of regarded as the father of geology. While people were studying Earth before Hutton, he really was the major scientist that was making a name for this study and is really kind of regarded as the first geologist, even though there may have been people studying before him. Now, before James Hutton published his ideas, the prevailing idea that people had about Earth was this idea of catastrophism. And what this idea was is saying that the Earth's natural features, like the mountain range in this picture, were caused by catastrophes, by quick, large events. Those mountains were formed, in a year. That river valley in a year. That other geological feature, months. That was the idea. So Earth and what we see on Earth and Earth's geologic structure was just due to one-time quick large events. But through James Hutton's research, he said, you know what? No, that's not what's happening here. It's not quick, large events. He promoted this idea of uniformitarianism. Think about the root of that, uniform. He said that geology, the formation of Earth's different features, is actually a really long process, and it happens very gradually. It's small changes yearly and on the decade scale and century scale. Now, you guys might pause and be like, well, isn't this about the history of evolution? Like, why are we talking about Earth? Well, I mean, these sciences, I mean, they're kind of all looped together, for one, especially during this time period. And two, now that you guys know a little bit more about evolution in general, you can see how maybe the prevailing idea about how organisms existed was kind of through this idea of catastrophism. And that if Hutton is proposing, hey, you know what, things can happen slowly and gradually, it's not that hard to make that jump over to organisms. So do want to make it clear, catastrophism and uniformitarianism, very, very earth words. But scientists at the time might be able to make a connection and be like, well, if this is true about Earth, is this idea true about other phenomena? So that's why we're mentioning James Hutton. All right, let's go to our next scientist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, publishing in around 1815. So still in the kind of same time period, but moving on in time. And Jean-Baptiste Lamarck has this idea that organisms change over time. He has a working idea essentially for natural selection and for evolution. And his idea was traits that are acquired during their lifetime, during an organism's lifetime, that help them to survive will pass on to the next generation. His famous example was with giraffes that we see here. So using the giraffes on the left, he's like, oh, well, these giraffes with shorter necks, they can't reach those trees. And so they keep stretching and they keep stretching their necks, and their necks are getting longer, which isn't completely off, right? Humans can do that too. We can stretch our necks specifically, but we can change our physical appearance. So he said, okay, these giraffes, they're going to stretch their necks. They can get more food. Because they can get more food, it's going to help them to survive. And when they reproduce, they're going to pass on that long neck to their offspring. Now, the idea isn't bad, but at this time, we didn't quite understand genetics. And you guys can probably point out, well, that's wrong. Right? Just because that giraffe stretched its neck during its lifetime doesn't mean it passes on to their offspring, because that's not a genetic trait. And you and I now know, okay, well, there's this thing called genes. They pass down generation after generation. But stretching out your neck doesn't go to the next generation. You guys getting a tattoo, even if it somehow helps you to survive, doesn't pass on to the next generation. That tattoo is not in your genes. So despite the fact that he was wrong, he, one, is going to influence future scientists, and two, he's also the first one to provide any kind of mechanism that evolution is happening. And that's kind of a big deal. Comte Buffon said, yeah, evolution didn't use that word, but evolution's a thing. And Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is like, you know what, I think it's a thing, and here's how it happened. So kind of powerful. And this is only 200 years ago. This is not an old idea. Like, this is actually a pretty new discovery. All right, so let's move on from Lamarck. We're going to go to another scientist, Charles Lyell. He's publishing in 1830, 1833, so a little bit after Lamarck. And Charles Lyell, like Hutton, James Hutton, he's also a geologist. So we're gonna go over back into the geology field. He was mentored by Hutton, so they knew each other. They talked with one another. Now, while Hutton was focusing on like how Earth developed and the events or non-events that helped develop Earth, Lyell was looking more at the age of Earth. Now, at this time, again, what we know about the Earth is mostly rooted from the Catholic Church. So the idea is that Earth is maybe about 4,000 to 6,000 years old. But through Lyell's research, he's like, you know what? No, this we've got to be older than a couple thousand years. He's studying all sorts of things, and if you guys take a geology class, I'm sure you will learn more about it. But he concludes, okay, Earth is so much older. Earth is at least 300 million years old. Now, you guys might be like, isn't it older? And it is. We're in the billions. We'll explore that more in this class. We're like at 4.6 billion. But, I mean, he's saying 300 million, and the prevailing idea was 6,000. So he has made Earth's lifespan so much larger. And again, you might be thinking, well, why do we care that he thinks Earth is longer? What does this have to do with evolution? But think about it. Think about what you do know about evolution. We know evolution takes a long time to happen. So 6,000 years for some species, that is not nearly long enough for any kind of change to happen in a population. But 300 million years? Oh, we got time now. Evolution can happen now. So this is providing a time scale in which evolution can work. Lyell was also instrumental because he was best friends with Charles Darwin, and we'll talk more about Darwin here in a little bit. Now, this meme, I want you to know, is just on Google. Like, this is a very well-known friendship between Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin, and they share their first name. Who knew? So the reason I mention this relationship is that Lyell and Darwin are talking. So even though Lyell is a geologist, I mean, he's sharing his ideas with Darwin and vice versa. And having these ideas that, okay, Earth is pretty old is helping to concrete Darwin's ideas of, okay, I have these hypotheses, but they don't quite make sense with 6,000 years. Lyell's like, hey, I'm doing this research. You got like 300 million years now, bro. And Darwin's like, this is wonderful. So that relationship is kind of crucial for our current understanding of natural selection and evolution. And that's our last geologist, by the way. So we got two more scientists left. The first one I'll talk about is kind of an unsung hero. Now, some of these other scientists you probably haven't heard of, and more than likely you also haven't heard of Alfred Russel Wallace, or just Wallace for short. But I like to give him credit here because he also came up with natural selection. So Darwin is kind of regarded as the father of natural selection. Like, he's the one who gets credit when it comes to evolution. Alfred Russel Wallace was right there with him. He came up with the idea for natural selection as well. What he did is he did a lot of studies also in tropical areas, not the Galapagos, but other tropical areas. And he sent his ideas to Darwin in 1858. Now keep in mind that year. So in 1858, Wallace and Darwin are friends. Wallace sends Darwin a letter saying, hey, I just got back from this study in Indonesia. I noticed this. I have this idea. And Darwin's like, really? Me too. Fortunately, this isn't one of those relationships where Darwin stole the ideas of Wallace or anything like that. They really did independently come up with this idea. But Wallace hadn't published it. I mean, he's sending it to his friend saying like, hey, like you study stuff too. Like, can you look over this? Does this look good to you? So it's kind of like this private correspondence before kind of breaking it to the scientific world, because you don't want to publish it if there's a whole bunch of holes in it. So again, keep in mind, so he sent his ideas to Darwin in 1858. Now let's talk about Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin's famous book is On the Origin of Species, that really outlines the mechanisms of evolution and natural selection. And it gets published in 1859, the year after Wallace sent him that letter. So if you look at the timeline, you're like, that seems kind of sketchy. But it really wasn't. If anything, for Darwin, who was already writing the book at the time, it almost brought him solace, like getting Wallace's letter saying like, oh, thank God, someone else also reached the same conclusion. I'm not going to be laughed out of the scientific community by publishing this book. So as kind of some backstory into Darwin's idea. So again, Darwin came up with the idea of natural selection as well. After his voyages to the Galapagos Islands, which you might be familiar with, but he really had that confirming source of Wallace. I like to think about it, if we want to talk school terms, if you're doing a problem set and you're like, Hey, Joe, can you just check my answers? Like, are you getting the same thing? Almost as like a check for yourself, right? Like, you don't want to be totally off base, and that's exactly what the relationship between Darwin and Wallace are. As I mentioned before, he's kind of famous for the Darwin's finches, or the different species of finches on the Galapagos Islands. And he is the one who actually coins the term natural selection. So there was no term natural selection beforehand. Evolution was a term that had been used before, but he's really the first one to propose not just the mechanism for natural selection, but actually giving it its name. Now, the last thing I'm going to leave you with is this YouTube video. And I think it's like a BBC special, a short little video that is talking about the relationship between Darwin and Wallace. It's kind of cool. They bring up some of the other scientists like Charles Lyell in it as well. And it tells you a little bit more about the interactions that they had. There's no notes or anything you need to take on the video, but it's a really nice insight into their relationship, which I personally think is cool. I mean, this is 150 years ago. These are some of the brightest minds at the time. And again, have really shaped our research to this day and into our future. So as this video ends, there's going to be a link that pops up to this YouTube video. This is the end of this video. Go watch that, and you can continue on in the lecture series.